Welcome to Decoding Leadership, where we break down the elements of humane and effective leadership. I'm your host, Jade Rubik. I'm really excited to introduce you to Molly Graham. She brings a wealth of experience from a lot of companies you've heard of, like Google, Facebook. Perhaps you've heard of Quip, which was acquired by Salesforce. In 2022, she founded Glue Club, a place for startup leaders to learn from each other. And she shares a lot of what she's learned over the years in her writing. I found her writing to be one of the most thought-provoking sources of information on leadership, and specifically in the startup space. And I've always appreciated her perspective and really look forward to her writing. I think you'll find this interview totally fascinating. She covers a lot of really, really interesting topics, and I can't wait to share it with you. It's nice to see you again after so long.
It's been a while. I guess we internet these days, but I haven't seen you in whatever face life
For a long time.
for a very long
Yeah.
time.
But I've been enjoying your writing, and it's been fun to flitter through adjacent spaces a little bit. And
Yeah, vice versa.
so, Molly, you are probably best known for the term giving away your Legos. I think you tapped into something really deep with that post about the experience of being in a rapidly scaling company. Do you mind telling the audience a little bit about the concept and what experiences you had that led up to it?
Yeah, for sure. Well, first of all, Jade, thanks for having me. Thanks for having this conversation. Yeah, so give away your Legos came from my experience at Google. I was at Google for a year and a half, and it was my first experience in technology. But I joined the communications department, and it was 25 people when I joined, and a year and a half later, it was 125 people. So I actually think that scale happened in 9 months. So it was sort of like 5x growth in 9 months, which for anybody that's been through that kind of scale, you know, it feels very crazy. Watching that happen, I started to see certain behaviors from people, certain emotional reactions. And then I left Google and I followed some wonderful people that I wanted to work with again to Facebook. And Facebook was like scale on fire. You know, I always tell people if you want to know how fast you have to grow, you should look at the graph of how fast your company is growing. And, you know, Facebook's graph for many, many years felt almost vertical at times. And so having watched that scale at Google and then coming into Facebook, and the company was growing so quickly at the time, I was employee probably like 500 something. And over the course of 5 years there, I think I left, we were 5,500 employees. I joined at 80 million users and I left at 1 billion users. When I joined, we were smaller than MySpace. People were like, aren't you just another site, and isn't Microsoft going to buy you? It's hard to remember what life was like back when MySpace was so big. But that experience from Google translated straight into Facebook, watching people struggle with the fact that the organization around them was changing so, so fast. And that meant that they had to change and evolve, that it meant that they couldn't just keep doing the things they had gotten used to, that they had gotten good at, that they had gotten confident about. In order to kind of keep up with that scale, they had to let go of things. They had to take their babies and pass them off to other people. I think in engineering, it's like you have to take an entire code base and give it to someone who might screw it up. You know, for me, one of my early experiences was taking over some of Facebook had a blog at the time, and I was taking over the blog from someone or taking over the social media presence. And that was really hard for the people that had built it from scratch. At Facebook, I eventually developed this talk that I would give to people on my team when change was about to happen, when we were about to hire someone new or we had to give away stuff to another team. I would talk about Legos and giving them away. And it basically eventually led me to, well, this is how I met Jade, but I did a talk at a New Relic conference about the idea of giving away your Legos. And eventually I turned it into a article with First Round, and it just took off. Like, I think I thought it was a fun metaphor. It was something I had used and had been really useful to me and my teams. But I think that what I didn't fully realize at the time was how common across many different types of companies the emotional experience of change is. And, fundamentally what rapid scale is massive amounts of change all the time. And I would just say humans on the whole are not really comfortable or happy about change. And so to get good at scaling, you have to get good at something that's very uncomfortable. And I always say, like, the Legos article, people have asked me to summarize it in like one sentence. And I would say there's two versions. The first is, I think it basically says to people, like, don't worry, it's going to be okay. It's like therapy in an article where it's like, oh, it doesn't mean the world is ending, that I feel this way and that I feel so uncomfortable all the time. It actually is normal. And then the second sort of one sentence version of the Legos article is your job inside of rapid scale is to make yourself irrelevant. That's actually your number one job when things around you are growing super fast. It is to work yourself out of a job all the time. And that is very uncomfortable.
Yes, and very unnatural. It is kind of the opposite of a lot of people's instincts with their work. Making yourself irrelevant it's scary.
It's scary, totally. And I think fear is such an interesting motivator for people. I think that, like, actually, one of the things that resonated is that people spend a lot of time inside these companies being scared. They're scared. I mean, even more so now, probably because, like, they're scared they're going to get fired. They're scared they're going to get laid off. They're scared they might be irrelevant. And they have to take a leap of faith on the idea that, like, actually making yourself irrelevant is the best way to stay relevant. It sounds crazy when you say it out loud to people, but as soon as you meet someone that's gone through rapid scale, they're like, yeah, I know. And I think it's just not something that is talked about all that often. Like, we talk about the logistics of scale, we talk about the tactics of scale, we talk about how to evolve process, but we don't talk about the emotional side of that experience and how hard and complicated it is. I now go around to all these different sort of high growth companies. I get asked to do what I call Legos talks, which I think of as group therapy. I give this talk based on the Legos article, and genuinely you can feel the entire room sometimes take a big sigh of relief, because it's like, oh, I'm not crazy. Like, I thought it was just me. I thought I was the only one that felt this way, and it turns out, like, this is normal. This is actually just what everyone feels. This is part of the experience. It doesn't mean anything's wrong. And that, I think it's just not something that people can find to other places, I guess.
I really love how you create these terms that create space for people to really feel okay about or kind of acknowledge what it is they're actually going through, because we often bring our professional selves to work and hide those parts away. And especially in such an uncomfortable environment, normalizing it just seems incredibly important.
Yeah, definitely. I think that there's nothing worse than feeling emotional and being on what I would call the roller coaster ride and feeling like you're alone. I think part of one of the experiences I had after I left Facebook, I wanted to learn what it took to build something from nothing. I felt like I had done scale and I had seen all sorts of crazy growth, and I really wanted to know what 0 to 1 looked like. So I went to this little teeny startup founded by a guy who's now very famous named Brett Taylor. He built this company called Quip, and I joined before we had a product and ran everything that wasn't engineering and product. I remember we launched, and the launch was very loud and lots of people cared about it. And we had a lot of people show up and use the product. And then after the launch, it was just very quiet. It was very empty for a little while. And I remember having, like, a huge emotional reaction at the time where I was like, what are we doing wrong? What am I doing wrong? And I went out to lunch with a friend of mine who had only spent time inside of seed stage startups, and he had only spent time inside of gaming companies, which have this sort of big boom and bust thing that happens. And I was just telling him a little bit about what I was feeling. And he looks at me and he goes, yeah, welcome to startups. And for me, that moment was like, oh, it's normal, like, what I'm feeling. And it was like, oh, okay, like, it doesn't feel as charged anymore. It doesn't feel as scary or overwhelming, because I know that this is almost how I'm supposed to feel. And I often think that's a lot of what the Legos article does for people, is just say, like, don't worry, it's okay. Actually, what you're feeling is normal. I tell folks that Facebook used to feel like we were going to drive the car off the cliff regularly. Like it wasn't like it was calm and organized. Like I feel like a lot of people look aspirationally at other companies and think it must be so well organized and calm and easy and obvious at Stripe or at OpenAI or at wherever. And it's like, no, man, it feels like a shit show. Like that's what it feels like. And just because it feels that way, it doesn't actually mean it is going to end in flames. I think Facebook regularly felt like, oh God, we're going to just completely fuck this up. I think it's just so much of the reason why I resonated. I think it's because it just helped people feel sane.
That makes a lot of sense. So you've now been at a lot of different companies on a lot of different executive teams. And one of the things I've just been dying to ask you is about your experience on all of those executive teams. You've been at Google, Facebook, Quip, Lambda School, and many others. Do you mind sharing of like what sort of variation you've seen on those teams and how they work together? And perhaps this can help dispel that sort of myth of perfection, but also maybe
Yeah.
also shed some light on what really worked at some of those places.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely was not on the leadership team at
Right,
Google.
right.
Definitely was not on the leadership team at Facebook. My boss at Google was on the leadership team. At Facebook, I got to observe a lot of that stuff. Ever since then, I've been on a leadership team wherever I've gone. I would say, first of all, one of the things you spend a lot of your career doing, particularly early on, is feeling like if I can just get behind this door, I will have power and I will make all the decisions. Like there's all these leadership team doors and title doors that you're like, if I could just be on that leadership team or be in that meeting or have this title, then I would know. And, anybody that's spent a lot of time running companies will tell you that actually most leadership team meetings are pretty dysfunctional and they're often quite boring. They're not really where work happens. And so, one of the things I talk about with startup CEOs when I work with them is the concept of sort of like a small leadership team and a big leadership team. And that's something that like I've just seen repeated almost everywhere I go. Like I'll just give you the Facebook example. So Facebook had this thing called M Team, which I think it was like 15 people when I was first there. It was like all of Mark's directs and all of Cheryl's directs. And by the time I left, I think it was 60 people, and it was sort of a symbolic organism. And Mark had something on Mondays where he met with varying sizes, but it was basically like the people that actually made the decisions. And it was mostly like his directs and a small group of people. And I think it was called Small Group. Like it had a very unsexy name that was just, whatever. But you sort of knew that that was like where a lot of the like discuss, debate, that sort of stuff that mattered to Mark happened. And that fundamentally as a structure is something I've seen repeated over and over again. It wildly depends on the CEO. It wildly depends on the company's culture, which frankly usually comes from the CEO in terms of how the company operates. But I've become a big believer in certainly like what I've set up that's worked well for me in the companies I've run is there is a small group of people, not more than 4, that you basically run the company with. And that is in the last company I ran, it was twice a week. I met with them on Mondays and Fridays. It sounds so crazy because it sounds like a lot of time, but it's literally just a collective brain. What happened this week? What are the key things we need to talk through? What's happening next week that we need to think through? What are we missing? And we didn't even really have an agenda. We would just like make an agenda together in the meeting. People would bring their different things and that was the kind of collective brain to run the company. And then we had the leadership team meeting, which happened every other week for 90 minutes. And one of the things I talk to CEOs a lot about is like, people think that leadership teams meetings are where decisions get made, but they're not. You can't make a decision with 15
No, it's
people. And most
impossible.
leadership teams have like 8 to 15 people on them, just because it's usually like all the directs of the CEO or whatever. Leadership team meetings are for 2 things. They are for informing people of what is going on, like, hey, this change is coming. Here's what we're doing about it. Or, hey, we're rolling out this thing. Here's what everyone needs to know. Informing people of what's happening around the tables of like the top thing that's going on. Those are actually good uses of time because so much of what the fabric of a company is do people know the context of what's happening? The second thing that leadership teams are useful for is input. You can make decisions lots of different ways, but one of them is sort of like get a bunch of input and then decide, or almost decide and then get a bunch of input. Leadership teams are great for giving input into decisions that are either almost made or that need to be made after the input. And that's a great way to use those rooms. But the most ineffective ones I've seen are ones where like they think they're a decision making body, or, nobody's really running the meeting, or it gets merged with a business review, which frankly should be separate. So, I would say every CEO and founders needs to figure out what's right for them. It absolutely evolves. I would say it's a structure that needs to be destroyed and recreated every 6 to 12 months. It will change as you scale dramatically. But the concept of the collective brain that makes decisions about the company and the body that's really good for informing and giving input remains relatively true, no matter what the scale is.
Oh, that's fascinating. It's interesting your observation about the small group and the big group, because I've also noted that a very similar pattern in so many different organizations I've gone to. And often that larger group does feel like strange sometimes, like that it's like it's hard for them to do very much because and there's kind of like this aspect of those groups where they feel like they're not actually doing that much sometimes, or so there's kind of an awkwardness to that second larger group sometimes that I've seen.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think part of it is because sometimes it's
Yeah,
perfunctory, right? Like sometimes it doesn't actually need to exist. It just exists because of history, or it exists because of egos.
yeah,
This is part of my point about destruction and recreation. It's actually just healthy in general for startups, but I think for leadership teams in particular, it's very valuable to phoenix them every so often, rename them, change the meeting length, change the meeting cadence. Like, I think the M team at Facebook, when it was 60 people, did a quarterly offsite,
yeah.
but that was it. And again, it was like a body that became, frankly, probably pretty symbolic. It was all the VPs at the company or something like that. When it started, it was much more of that like inform input kind of body. I think part of what companies are slow to do is destroy them and recreate a body that's actually useful. And part of that is it can hurt people's feelings if you take them off the leadership team. It's like a whole thing. And I know that's scary and intimidating for CEOs at times.
I love how you talk about that kind of phoenix effect, because one thing I've really seen in companies rapidly scaling is there's this resistance to changing the structure of things, and it causes so many problems, like the way that people communicate with each other or the way that the meetings are being run. They need continual reinvention, and I often just get really frustrated because it's like everywhere you look, people really don't want to do that. How have you helped encourage that creative destruction?
Yeah. It's not comfortable, but I don't think anything about building companies is particularly comfortable as per the conversation about Legos. Yeah, I mean, I think like I wrote a post about this actually, about the fact that companies are better at addition than they are of subtraction, which
Yeah.
is a concept I ripped completely from the CEO of Shopify, Toby Lutke, who he said it to me on a call once. And I was like, that is so true. Like, it's just so elegantly said. And it made me think a lot about why are we so much better than adding and subtracting? And to be honest, the most obvious example is hiring, right? We're so much better at hiring than we are at firing. Why? Because firing is uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Firing requires you to have hard conversations. It requires you to face the fact that you screwed up the hiring. Like, it requires you to actually like deal with a problem. It feels emotionally easier to add. That is true of products. That is true of processes. That is true of people. And so, leadership team meetings are fundamentally kind of a hybrid of a process and a people thing, because as I said, people spend a lot of their life trying to get inside the door of the leadership team meeting. So once you put them in there, taking them out can lead people to quit, which sounds crazy, but it's true. So, I think destruction is complicated emotionally. Think of removing something from a product. It's interesting because these are muscles that you either build early as a company or you're just bad at them. Like, I actually think Facebook was very good at destruction, which was so painful as a company because Mark would regularly suggest destroying something that people were like, you can't do that. He had no balls about pissing off his entire user base, which was extremely painful if you worked there, and actually led to a company that was really good at learning and evolving and changing. And then you look at a lot of companies that are primarily good at adding and have never really shut down a product or iterated significantly. Like, I always think the difference between Facebook and Twitter was that Twitter was scared to piss off its users. Like, Twitter was scared to do the big redesigns and the big evolution that, for better or for worse, Facebook got really comfortable with. And it led to Facebook really figuring out its growth engine and what drove its business. I think Twitter remained a little bit stuck. I think subtraction and destruction are not comfortable, particularly for folks that have been around a long time. When you've been around a long time, you can always explain why the meeting exists or why the process was built the way it is. I mean, but fundamentally, it's the same as refactoring code, right? Refactoring organizations, refactoring meetings, those are very painful. It's a huge investment that you have to choose to take on wisely, and it's wildly valuable, both monetarily and from an efficiency perspective.
Absolutely. This actually reminds me of another example of something that's uncomfortable. That's from one of my favorite posts by you, which is about designing the power structures within a startup very intentionally. I was wondering if you would mind like summarizing that a bit, because it really blew my mind when I read it. And I just want this audience to hear a little bit about it.
I love it. Jade, you've read all the things. Thanks. I loved putting that post out there because I think that, when we talk about org design, how to build a leadership team or how to build a company, a lot of what we talk about sounds like an egalitarian society. I when I lead this session at Glue Club, which is the community that I run for operators now, I put up an org chart that's like the one you would get off the internet, right? It's like the CEO, and then it has like 10 little boxes: the head of engineering, the head of product, the head of design, the head of finance, the head of legal, and all the boxes are the same size and they're all completely equal. And a lot of what you see when CEOs go to build orgs is that they just start checking off the boxes, so you'll get to this 50-person company that has, 6 executives, and you're like, why do we have these people? And it's, because the board told the CEO they needed to hire execs, and they started going through and checking off boxes. What I strongly believe is, number one, particularly as a startup, the most valuable thing you can do is have the fewest number of leaders possible. My number is 3. Like, if you can scale up to 100 or even sometimes 200 people with like 3 senior execs, happy. By senior execs, what I mean is you can bundle functions together. You and I haven't talked about this, but I'm a big believer in having like one technology exec that everything is bundled under. Go to market, same, for as long as you can. Eventually you have to split them out for a bunch of reasons, but like, for as long as possible, having 3, maybe 4 execs makes your life so much easier. Instead of having a product leader negotiate with an engineering leader about what's important, you just have one single exec that's like, here's what we're doing and why. It obviously like creates more possibility for failure, but it makes you so much faster than all these execs having to negotiate with each other. And the PowerPoint is, you have to decide who sits on top of that. Fundamentally, you have to decide which exec should be making those decisions. And go-to-market is the easiest place for me to talk about this, because you basically have businesses that either should be led by sales or should be led by marketing. If you think about like a Slack, which had thousands of customers early on of a very small size, that is a business that should be led by marketing. Like, these days it's called product-led growth. From a go-to-market perspective, it's a marketing-led motion, meaning it's all about building tools and systems that let you reach as many people as possible and convert customers with no one talking to them as fast as possible, because it's a high velocity motion with a relatively low dollar amount. So you can't spend a lot of money on every customer. Otherwise, you'll be upside down on your unit economics. Whereas if you're a much bigger sale, like a CRM or some, HRIS or some big piece of infrastructure that people buy, you might be more of a sales led motion where you're going to have a sales leader sitting on top of the organization and marketing serves the sales team. But the point there is you can't hire a head of sales and a head of marketing and expect them to duke it out. You actually have to pick which exec to hire first, which exec is more senior, which potentially which exec reports to the other exec. And a lot of folks just go in and they hire two folks that may or may not get along. They both think they run the show, and it leads to all sorts of complexity and slowness. Where if you actually say, you know what, our business needs a marketing engine, I'm going to hire that marketing leader. Everything that happens after that is going to be about supporting that marketing engine until, for example, we need to build another motion like an enterprise motion or whatever. But you decide that power sits with marketing and then you hire that way. That is actually like efficient org design. It helps you much better scope the role of the person that you're hiring. You need a more senior leader. You need a more seasoned leader. You need someone that knows how to put together a whole machine, blah, blah, blah. So I think the more you can do to understand how your org should map to your business, and if you're going to hire one powerful exec in each role, who should that person be? What should their DNA be? Give them the power instead of having two leaders that have to duke it out. It's just much faster. Did I summarize that well,
So
Jade?
well. And what I love about it is that you're being very conscious of like what the market and what your product and your offering, like how it should exist as an organization, and you're making some of those decisions instead of just kind of hoping that you'll get what you want. And it just seems like you get radically simpler organizations, you get much better decision making, and it also evolves over time, but in the way that you want. So I think on the product development side, it might be like engineering, product, or design. And I can imagine companies where any of those roles would be your first executive. And that makes sense. You can build your whole organization around that.
It does. And, the more contemporary, interesting example in the AI world is research, right? One of the most interesting things I love watching is sort of what is the role of product management in all these different companies. And, particularly when you go to hire a head of product and you're like, you just go hire some product leader from like Pinterest or from Slack or from Facebook or from Google or from Microsoft. And you think, oh, they say product manager. They all did the same thing. Turns out product management at all those different companies is completely different. Where did the power center lie at a given company wildly defines what the role of product management is, right? Like at Google, product managers were like little CEOs. At Pinterest, design ran a lot of stuff. So product management was much more of an execution function, which, by the way, I think is very similar to a lot of AI companies where product management is more about shipping and keeping things on track. And research is where a lot of the power lies. So being cognizant of the nature of what you're building from either a business perspective or a product perspective, depending on what kind of company you're running, and then manifesting that in your organization saves you so much pain.
I just love that. So I'd like to turn to your recent TED Talk. First of all, I'm just curious what it was like to actually do a TED Talk. That must have been such a surreal experience.
Yeah, it was really cool. I don't have many things on my bucket list. People are like, because I write on the internet, they're like, aren't you writing a book? As of right now, writing a book is not on my bucket list. But when my friend called and said she was organizing this new conference for TED and asked if I would want to give a TED Talk, I was like, yeah, I want to do that. That sounds like something I'd like to do once and learn from. And, the way I went into it, I was like, I want to put something out in the world that I'm proud of, like Legos. Like I want it to be helpful to people, an artifact that is complete unto itself. And I want to learn from this experience. I want to learn from this amazing machine that TED has built that basically churns out hundreds of 8-minute talks every year. It was so hard. I'm someone that gives 30-minute talks all the time off the cuff. I'm like a slides, bullets, wing it girl. And that is not what TED is. TED is like, I wrote a script. I memorized the script. It was a really interesting, complicated experience. And TED Talks, well, the one I gave is 8 minutes long. And 8 minutes is not long at all. It is amazing to fit a whole concept inside 8 minutes. It involves so much killing of your babies, sentences you love or concepts you want to fit in, but just don't work. It was really humbling. And I also learned a ton from it in terms of how loose I am with my normal speaking. I would say how much I repeat myself. We're taught that in order for people to absorb information, you have to say it over and over again. There is no space for that. In 8 minutes, you just say it once and you move on.
Wow, interesting. Well,
Yeah.
I loved the talk. The topic was about cliff jumping versus ladder climbing. This is yet another great Mollyism of like these sort of concepts that help explain some choices that people go through with their career progression. Do you mind sharing your mini TED talk?
My mini
Yeah.
talk. Yeah, I won't summarize the whole
Yeah.
thing. Yeah, so this is actually something that someone wrote on a whiteboard for me when they were trying to convince me to take a job. It's this guy named Chamath Palihapitiya, who lots of people know because he does the All In podcast. He was trying to convince me to move from HR to work for him and help him build a mobile phone, which Lord knows why anybody asked me to do that. But he was like, he just like drew this set of stairs on the whiteboard and he was like, look, here's your career. It's going to be really boring. You can spend 2 years trying to become this level and take another step up and become this level. And then, in 10 years, you'll be a director. And you can do that if you want to. But the most interesting careers in the world are made up of what he called J curves. He drew this like J next to it. And he was like, you jump and you like fall off a cliff and then you climb your way out of it. And he's like, you like scramble your way out of it. But eventually, if you do this, enough times, you're going to end up so far ahead of the stairs, you can't even see them anymore. At the time, I was like, yeah, whatever. I understand this is you trying to convince me to work for you and do this thing. And then I was like, oh, yeah, I kind of want to do that. I want to take this weird risk that I'm really scared I might fail. Everything he said, sadly, love him, but it was like not, yeah, anyway, was correct. I spent 6 months falling off a cliff. I was like, I'm an idiot. I don't know what I'm talking about. I was meeting with engineers and asking the dumbest questions of my life. 6 months into it, I got the lowest performance rating of my whole life. Chamath handed it to me with glee and was like, you need to figure your shit out. And then about 9 or 12 months into it, I came back from Taiwan and I like drew the hardware layout for a mobile phone on a whiteboard for Chamath. And I was like explaining to him why we couldn't make certain decisions that he wanted to make. And I remember leaving that meeting and being like, oh shit, I actually know things. Like I'm like actually like I didn't know shit about mobile. I didn't know anything about phones. And now I can draw this hardware layout. I remember Chamath looking at me being kind of proud and impressed after that meeting. And it was my first taste of how far you can go if you're willing to take a risk and if you're willing to face the potential for failure and the fear that's associated with leaving something that you know you're good at and trying something that you genuinely might not be good at. I would say it got me addicted to doing that because I get bored really easily. When things get stable and easy, I'm like, I gotta go. When I'm scared I can't do a job, I'm like, okay, that's probably the job for me. I love learning and I love challenging myself. Like I say in the TED Talk, cliff jumps, which is what I call them now. Jade has seen the transformation. They went from J curves to cliff jumps. For me, the feeling of jumping off something and having your stomach rise up in your throat is what those jobs feel like. Cliff jumps are like a weird elevator. They take you to some place you could never imagine if you were staying on the stairs and leave you qualified for things you wouldn't have been if you stayed on the stairs. The world these days is going to reward folks that are willing to take risks and that learn how to get good at facing fear and jumping off cliffs.
Yeah. I loved that. I read the original article. I also watched the TED Talk. I loved them both. One thing I wanted to ask about is sometimes when you're taking these jumps, you're trying to assess, like, am I going to make it? And I've been in situations where I've been encouraged to take these jumps, but I've also seen that there's some support for me as I'm plummeting. I'm curious about your thought about being supported when you're also like being hurled off of a cliff.
Totally. So I talked about this a little bit in the TED Talk, but it was an area that I had to trim. I feel very uncomfortable about trimming this because there's a lot of nuance in what makes a good jump. And one of the things I've spent a lot of time in my life, particularly in the last couple of years, kind of like coaching people or talking them through career decisions. I would say there's different dynamics at play when you're making choices. One of the most important ones is financial anxiety when it comes to taking a jump is important because there's diffuse financial anxiety, which is just like, I'm scared I might run out of money. When I walk with people that have that fear, what I say is do the math. So, how much money do you need per month to fund your life? And really, what I would say is, how much money do you need per month to fund your life and feel safe? Feel safe is a buffer that is different for everyone and is really important psychologically because if you take a leap and that leap can look a bunch of different ways, but it leads to a bunch of financial anxiety. Let's say you take a leap to start your own company and you are assuming everything's going to work out in 6 months, but it actually ends up being 8 or 12 and your family is struggling. You're going to make all sorts of weird decisions when you start having genuine financial strain and anxiety, and they're not going to be good decisions. So for me, it's really important to do the math. What is your burn rate per month for your family to feel safe? How much runway do you have given whatever choice you're making? So, like, if you're choosing to leave a job with no other job, like, which is a very common thing that I spend time with people on. You're choosing to start a company, you're choosing to go write a book, you're choosing to go back to school. Those are all decisions where there's a big financial thing behind it. You got to do the math. You got to know what your burn rate is. You got to know how long you have. You got to know what you're going to do if you start getting close to that moment when you need a job or you need more money. One of the things I say to people, for example, that are leaving a job without another job, I say, okay, so let's say your burn rate's like $10,000 or $15,000 a month. What you have to believe is that you can get enough consulting work or other work that you can make $10,000 or $15,000. Do you believe that? And a lot of times if you quantify it, it makes it very specific financial anxiety where it's like, okay, I need to believe that. Do I believe that? No. Okay, maybe I shouldn't make this leap. So I think the financial thing there is not to be underestimated, and it's not like all leaps are a good idea. The other thing I would just say is like the thing you said, which is sort of like the psychological safety or the question of like, what happens if I fail? And I think there's like two dimensions to that. One is like, so when I when I was considering taking the phone job at Facebook, I talked to Sheryl Sandberg and she said to me, that project is going to be dead in a couple of months, but you can take that job if you want to. And when it closes down or when it shuts down, you'll still have a job here. And it was very like not encouraging of me taking that job. But actually for me, it was like, great. You're not going to fire me if I like fail at this. It made me feel like I could do that and there was a safety net underneath it. A lot of times, if you're inside a company and you've done really well at something, they will offer you a new, weird, exciting, high potential for failure job. It's one of the safest places to take risks like that because they're they already know you were good in one circumstance, so you've got a bunch of leeway to fail. It's one of the things I tell people inside of fast growing companies. This is the place to take risks. You got to first prove you're good at stuff, make people love you, be the person everybody wants to work with, and then take risks because that's where you can see your growth skyrocket because they're probably not going to fire you if you fail. And I think that psychological safety of just like, what's the worst case scenario is generally a good exercise to do. The worst case scenario often is not as bad as your fear makes it out to be. And fear can keep you strapped to the stairs. It can keep you strapped to a big, consistent paycheck in a way that is unhealthy. I have friends that have made a lot of money, and because they've never done the work to examine the fear or the dynamics that keep them where they are, they stay and they're miserable. Obviously, money and stability are important factors, and they can be distractions. They can be safety blankets in a not good way that keep people in jobs where they're not learning and growing, in dynamics where they're being undermined in a variety of ways. And I think part of what you have to do is examine what you're afraid of and try to understand if you're staying because of specific financial needs to make you feel safe, or if you're staying because you're scared you might fail. And if you were going to fail, like, really, what's the worst case scenario? Like, is everybody going to think you're a failure for the rest of your life? No, probably not, because you are like good at a bunch of stuff. So, like, staying because of fear is, well, it just leads to like a little bit of an under optimized career.
That's a really good way of putting it. One thing I've really appreciated about your writing is you have this way of coming up with good labels and metaphors for things. So you have giving away your Legos, cliff jumping, and ladder climbing. You have all of these terms that I think they're really great because you can kind of take these concepts with you and they're just kind of permanent. They just become a fixture of the way you see things. I'm super curious how you have come up with these things. Is it a part of who you are, or is it something you learned how to do?
No, Jade, it's just who I am. It's just how my weird brain works. I couldn't even tell you where it comes from. I think it might be because I grew up watching the Muppets. My brain just has weird little monsters that run around it all the time. For me, it's probably also how I process the world. Like, one of the moment I realized my brain is genuinely weird and different was when I wrote another article with First Round about a monster that I manifested, because after I'd gone through rapid scale a couple of times, I got very used to this emotional roller coaster that I was on. And literally, my brain turned the emotions into a Muppet. And it was like this little Muppet that just lives with me. Whenever I was having a bad day where, I was feeling territorial or insecure, I would manifest it as this monster. My monster's name is Bob. On good days, he's just nibbling on my toes, but on bad days, he's eating my face and sending my Slack messages. It's been very helpful to me and to other people to like manifest those emotions, both to normalize them, to realize that like Bob doesn't actually have your best interest at heart. He's trying to make you like the worst version of yourself. You can name your monster whatever you want. And sorry to all the people named Bob, but I think manifesting Bob, I was like, Molly, on what planet do people just come up with these things? And then I was talking to someone and they were like, oh, yeah, that's literally like a therapeutic thing. People have you externalize your anxiety into a friendly monster. And I was like, okay, I don't know.
That's
But
so awesome.
but yeah, no, that's just the way my brain works. So unfortunately, or fortunately.
I think it's great. I think you've become a very good interpreter, or it's that's not really not the right word for it, but there's this way that you've described your own experiences and your observations that I think you've continually done so in a way that's helpful to other people. I've certainly benefited from it.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think one of the last questions, as we get towards the end of these questions, one thing I wanted to ask you about was you've been recently building leadership communities. Do you mind describing Glue People and what you've been up to the last couple of years?
Yeah, for sure. So I started on a journey a couple of years ago. I realized I didn't want to work for someone else anymore. They always say you should only build something yourself if it's the last thing you can imagine doing, because it's hard and painful. And definitely hit that point where I was like, this is the only thing I can imagine doing. But I didn't start with an idea. I just started on a journey. And it was very uncomfortable because I'm the kind of person that was raised to identify myself with my job and my career and fancy titles. And so the process of building something myself has been entirely about experimentation. And for a couple of years, I called it experiments with friends. I gathered people I wanted to work with and then figured out what I wanted to do. About 4 or 5 months into this period, I was just struggling with so many people reaching out to me on LinkedIn and other places asking to spend 30 minutes with me to talk about operations and running a startup. I had a group that was really valuable to me when I was sort of COOing for many years. It was this thing that my friend Don Fall and I started called the Breakfast Club. And it was just a group of COOs that met once a month in the morning. And it was like a therapy group. It was basically, we would just talk about what was going on, and we would, I don't know, it was a safe space to talk about the crazy, is what I would say. And so I was like, I'm just going to see if the Breakfast Club is a sort of entity that I can gift to others. And all we did was put out a survey saying, hey, we're going to do this thing. One cohort, one group was what I intended. I thought we were going to have one group of 12. And we got a lot of responses, like a lot of responses. And then we launched, I think the first cohort had like 40 people in it. We started on this journey of basically, it's, what Glue Club has become is basically a place where leaders of fast growing companies go to find sanity, confidence, skills, and validation that they can't find inside their companies. Like the nature of being a leader inside a startup is that you're often the most senior person there. So you don't have anybody to learn from. And when you're senior, you often also don't have anybody to talk to about, hey, is this normal crazy or actually crazy? What Glue Club has become is a place where leaders that want to grow can go to find peers that they can learn from and a safe place to sort of grow and develop themselves in whatever way feels most important, but also to kind of like have a conversation around like work and life and what role should work play and what level of crazy is acceptable given where you are in work. For me, it's been like such a fascinating journey of what I love doing. I think what I would have told you as a leader and an operator is that I loved management. But one of the things I've done over the last couple of years is deconstruct management and realize that I love teaching. I don't think I ever would have been able to say that a couple of years ago, but I did learn that through Glue People. I love coaching and I'm not a coach. One of the things I say to people is like, I'm not a coach. Coaches are trained to help you become the best leader you can be by asking thoughtful questions and giving you frameworks. That is not what I am. I'm not trained as a coach. I'm more of an advisor, meaning someone that's going to listen to you, might ask you some good questions, but occasionally is just going to tell you what I think. What I really love is the word I would use sponsorship. And that's one thing that I really get to do through Glue Club is I get to help people grow. I get to help them see what they're great at. I get to help them learn what good looks like, which is hard to do if you've never seen it before. And that's really fulfilling to me. And again, this has all been an evolutionary journey, but it's been super joyful to invest in a broad group of people and help them figure out what they want.
It's so interesting. I've had some parallel aspects of my own work over the last, 5 years. I even use the same terminology around coaching and advising and doing more advising than coaching. And I find that tremendously rewarding. That really resonates.
This is why we get along,
yes,
Jade.
Exactly. This has been so much fun. I really, really appreciate your time today.
Yeah.
So if somebody listens to this and they'd like to find you on the internet or find out more about Glue People, where should they go?
I would say you can go two main places. The first is I have a Substack called Lessons. I think it's mollyg.substack.com. And I publish on wildly varied timelines, but that's where you get longer form stuff. And then I do a lot of writing on LinkedIn. And you can find links to Glue Club from there, but it's just glueclub.com and you can dig around and see what we're about and apply if you're interested. That's where you can find me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This has been a total pleasure, and I can't wait to share it with people.
Thanks so much for having me, Jade. Yeah. This was fun.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Decoding Leadership. As always, I welcome your questions and feedback. And if you're looking for coaching or advisory help, you can contact me at rubik.com. See you next time.